So I'm going to go back and I'm going to apply squash and stretch to my existing bouncing ball. Now there's a couple of things that we need to keep in mind when we're doing this. The first thing is, based on the demonstration that I gave, I did not change the size of my sphere. And let me just create a new document just to demonstrate this point. I'm going to create a sphere and I'm going to create a squash and stretch. So I'm going to go back under the deform menu, choose squash and stretch, and it just so happens that the squash and stretch has the same size or height as the default sphere. So what I mean by that is if I move over the squash and stretch, there's this purple bar that indicates the deformation range. And it just so happens that that is the right size for the default size of the sphere. Now if we make our sphere bigger, I'll just take the sphere, I'll double its size, and if I go to squash and stretch, make the squash and stretch a child of the sphere, and I go and find factor and I play with it, you'll see that it's squashing and stretching not the entire ball, but just basically the center half of it. Okay, so it is key to keep in mind that you might need to resize the sphere or the squash and stretch if you changed any of those sizes. So you can go to the squash and stretch and you can play with things like top and bottom. So right now if I adjust the top, there is a slider bar here, but I can exceed that slider bar. In fact, in Cinema 4D, you can typically exceed any slider bar a couple of different ways just by keying in the value. So I'll just type in 100, an additional 100 along the top to make that 200. And you can see that that changes the value of the squash and stretch. So if I take the squash and stretch out, it actually increased the top end of the squash and stretch. So you can see that the distribution of the squash and stretch is higher on the top than it is in the bottom. And if I go to squash and stretch and I go find that bottom value, I'll change that from -100 to -200, and you can see that it extends that squash and stretch. So you can change the size of the squash and stretch, you can change the size of the model that is being squashed and stretched, and there are some other ways to control that. But by default, if you make a standard size sphere without changing its size, you should be able to go in and create just a standard squash and stretch. One of the other things that we need to keep in mind with squash and stretch is that when we apply the squash and stretch deformation, or really any kind of deformation to geometry, one of the things that happens is that based on the resolution of the mesh or the amount of segmentation that's in the mesh, the deformation is going to influence the mesh in different ways. So in other words, let me just reset the sphere size here to the standard 100 centimeters, and I'm going to select my squash and stretch, and I'll just kind of goof around a little bit with the factor. This seems to work okay, but if I want a smoother transition with my mesh, I can bump up the segmentation. So currently my segmentation is at 24. If I double that segmentation, I have the ability to have a lot more detail in terms of the way that that mesh is deformed. So you can think of the segmentation as the amount of resolution that's inside the model. And so at this point, this will really help smooth out. If I want to be really dramatic about some of the squash and stretch, I have the ability to really kind of play around with these numbers and not be so concerned about the geometry flatting out or getting distorted. So that's just a couple of things to keep in mind. One other thing that we need to keep in mind is that I currently have, and I'm going to apply the squash and stretch to an existing animation. Now, one of the things that that we should keep in mind with the parent-child relationship is that I'm just going to pull the squash and stretch out for just a moment. If I select the sphere, and this works with animation as well, I'm going to move the sphere off to the side so it's no longer at the position of 0x, 0y, and 0z. Okay? Now when I've introduced the squash and stretch, I need that squash and stretch to line up with my sphere. Okay? Now if this sphere is positioned in a place where the animation has already started, I got a couple of different options. The clumsy option is to nest the squash and stretch or any deformation inside the model and then move that deformation to line it up with the model. Okay, but the easiest thing to do is simply once the squash and stretch becomes a child of the model, all you have to do is set the coordinates of that squash and stretch to 0, 0, 0. Whenever you set the position of a child object to 0, 0, 0, it uses the position of its parent object as its registration point. So that's the simple solution there. Make the squash and stretch a child of the sphere, and then zero out the position coordinates, hit apply, and then I'll make sure that that is perfectly lined up. So that's going to be the strategy that I use to apply the squash and stretch back into my animation. So let me do that really quickly, but we'll do that in the next presentation.